Hi, everyone, and welcome to our second Google Hangout for Course 3 of Civil War and Reconstruction. We are broadcasting live from the Columbia Center for New Media Teaching and Learning. Just a few quick housekeeping items. If you want to ask questions, just click on the grid icon in the upper right of your screen, and you'll be able to ask questions. And we will be live for the next hour. So without further ado, Professor Eric Foner, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And I'm very happy to be here for this last Google Hangout for the Course 3 on the Reconstruction period. So I'm going to just go to some of the questions that have been posted here, and I invite everyone else who wants to post questions, and we'll see about trying to answer them. Are we okay? Mm-hmm. Okay. A person asked a question about, which actually relates to the use of the term revisionist as schools of history. In the first course, which was about the coming of the Civil War, revisionist referred to historians in the 1920s and 30s, James G. Randall, people like that, who argued that the Civil War was unnecessary, it was a blundering generation, produced a needless conflict, and the slavery issue was artificial or could have easily been settled. So they were Southern or some Northern, like Randall, but that's one group, the revisionist historians in relation to the coming of the Civil War. When we get to Reconstruction, we also talk about revisionist historians, but it's a totally different group. It's the historians who tried to revise, that is, interpretations of Reconstruction put forward by the old Dunning School, the traditional view. And these are people in the 1960s and 70s, Kenneth Stamp, Leon Litwack, John Hope Franklin. It's a different group, even though we call them revisionist. I guess anybody who tries to revise interpretations of history gets called revisionist. But the revisionists in the Reconstruction, and the question here related to how they viewed the radical Republicans, saw the radicals as sort of forward-looking advocates of civil rights, advocate of black rights, in contradistinction to the traditional view of Reconstruction, which saw them as the kind of evil geniuses of the so-called disasters of Reconstruction. So the revisionists from writing about the pre-Civil War period didn't much like the radicals. They were partly responsible for the needless Civil War. The revisionists, a different group writing about Reconstruction, were rather favorable to the radicals. So all that proves is that historians need to come up with better terminology, or maybe a more varied terminology, to describe schools of historical thought. But thanks for, it's an interesting point that we do, it can be kind of confusing. I can certainly see that. Okay, we'll move on to the next question now. That's the same question, basically. So we're going to move down to the next one. About the MOOC itself. I missed the first two courses in the series, not knowing of the program. Are there outreach plans? Can it be audited? I mean, we have now just 2 more weeks to go in this third and last course, online course. But the first 2 courses will be out there, wherever that is, forever. And even though they're not live in the sense that there will not be these live discussion forums connected with them, anybody can go back and look at those lectures, look at the documents. Anybody can go back and, in a sense, take the courses, even though they're not they're not live, but they are out there. So if you found the third course interesting and you want to find the prehistory of the coming of the Civil War and the Civil War, I invite you to go back and look at the lectures, the interviews, the documents, etc. They will always be available, even though the process of taking the course will no longer be out there. Okay, here comes another question. What advantages, aside from reaching more people, does teaching my MOOC hold for you? What have been the most interesting, exciting, or innovative aspects of this? Well, you know, I'm a pretty low-tech person. I had very little understanding of what a MOOC might be when we started on this project. I worked with a wonderful team of people here at Columbia who have been instructing me on what's going on and helping to make this what it is. I mean, to me, the promise or the the quality of the MOOC that I find most appealing is exactly reaching more people, reaching people outside of the academic world, outside of the classroom. And certainly I found it very rewarding to have messages, emails, from people all over the world. I mean, there's over 100 countries with participants represented in this MOOC. Or sometimes I go and lecture at, other universities or institutions like the New York Historical Society or the Library of Congress. And people come up to me and say, hey, I'm taking your online course. And I had no, obviously, contact with them personally until they come up and identify themselves. But and it's been also very interesting and innovative just to see the kinds of people taking the course, which range all over from students, teachers, retirees, homeschoolers, people in other countries just wanting to learn something about American history. So, I mean, that is the tremendous advantage here of making knowledge available to more people, which is really what all of us try to do, to make our knowledge of history accessible to as many people as possible. And I'm sure that this technology will make that more and more possible as time goes on. So, I've enjoyed doing it, and I think it's been successful in that sense that a lot of people who would never have the opportunity to take a course of mine at Columbia University were able to benefit as much as they can from my teaching. So that's a very gratifying thing for a teacher. Okay, let's go to the next one. Why have you spent so much of your career with the Civil War and Reconstruction? Yeah, that's a good question. The first history course I ever taught, the first history course I ever took in college, this is way back in the early 1960s, was from a great teacher here, James P. Shenton, a wonderful legendary college teacher at Columbia where I was an undergraduate. It was a year-long seminar on the Civil War, the coming of the Civil War Reconstruction. This was as the civil rights movement was reaching its peak in the early 1960s. Every day there were people in the streets demonstrating for equal rights, North and South. The country was in a great crisis over these issues. And Shenton had that wonderful capacity of a teacher to make the history relevant. We were studying the origins of the world we were living in, what we were seeing every day out in our society, and we were studying how we got there, what the origins were. And it shows you what a, talented and inspiring teacher can do in helping to shape the interests and preoccupations of a student and then a historian. So I have devoted most of my career to this period, not all. I wrote a book about Thomas Paine and the American Revolution. I've written some things on the 20th century, but yes, most is about the Civil War Reconstruction, because I think those issues are so relevant to the world we're living in today. The issues about race, the issues about citizenship, equality. What is it in our society? What is the legacy of slavery 150 years after the end of the Civil War for American society? Those are still questions which are part of our lives today. And so, as long as those questions remain relevant to American life, I think people like myself and others will always be drawn to studying those periods and trying to find out some of the origins of how we got there. But another thing, I should say, I am very interested in social change, how social change occurs. And I'm very interested in this period in abolitionists, radical Republicans, ordinary former slaves. How do people change society for the better? How do they try to? And that learning how that happened is also relevant to the present and for those who want to make this a better society, how to try to do that and how it has happened in the past. So, that's another thing that draws me to this period, because of the dramatic changes that were brought about in our society. Okay, let's go to the next question. Can you talk more about the Ku Klux Klan and gender? What was the scale or dimension of female involvement in terrorism? Interesting question. Most of the people committing, or overwhelmingly, the people committing acts of terrorist violence were men, young men, basically. Women didn't go riding around at night on horseback with gangs of people assaulting people or burning their homes or assassinating them. But women certainly played a role in the Klan. The robes that people wore, the disguises people wore, were being sewn by women, by their wives, by other women. Women provided alibis. Sometimes when these people were put on trial, people would come forward with alibi. No, they were home all night. This person couldn't have been out there. I testify. My husband was home all night. even when they really weren't. It's mostly a male operation, but and maybe the most important thing is just sympathetic opinion. The hardest thing about rooting out terrorism is when there is widespread support for it in the society. Most people do not go around committing murder or committing, acts of terror, no matter what their political feelings are. But there were many, many people in the South, male and female, who were, in a sense, sympathetic to the aims, even if they may have thought, this kind of violence is maybe out of hand, people are just going too far. But really, I understand why, because they're trying to restore white supremacy, and that's a good thing. So I think providing a sympathetic public opinion, so to speak, was also a role that women played an important part in. If women in the South had said, no, this is completely outrageous and must stop, it might have stopped, but most of them didn't. Okay, let's see. Do you see connections between the Republican Party of today and the debates over Reconstruction during that period? Well, of course, the Republican Party today historically is the lineal descendant of the Republican Party founded in the 1850s. But in terms of its political configuration or its demographic configuration, it's entirely different, right? Back then, the Republican Party was, up to the Civil War, a purely Northern party. In Reconstruction, it spreads into the South overwhelmingly on the basis of African-American voters, with some white support, but not that much. And that was the Republican Party, the solid middle class and upper class North, farmers, urban people, industrialists, craftsmen, and very, very poor slaves, former slaves, that is to say, of course, in the South. Now, today, the center of gravity of the Republican Party is the South. Southern voting, as everybody knows, used to be almost entirely Democratic. Now it's almost entirely Republican. I don't think there's a single senator from the old Confederate states anymore who is a Democrat. I could be wrong about that. But certainly the overwhelming number of governors, members of Congress, et cetera, in the South are Republicans. The black vote has shifted entirely from the Republican Party, where it was ensconced up into the New Deal anyway, where blacks could vote. By then it was only in the North. And today, of course, the vast, vast majority of African Americans vote Democratic. So the Democratic Party is much more associated today with issues of civil rights than the Republican Party is. So the configuration of the parties has shifted enormously. On the other hand, there are maybe more continuities in some ways. The Republican Party of the Civil War Reconstruction era was very closely tied to the major business interests, to industrialists, financiers. And today, the Republican Party is also very closely tied to people like that. I mean, look at where the money is coming from for these Republican campaigns, the primary campaigns now underway, or at least the run-up to the presidential election of 2016. Not that the Democrats are also not tied into many people with a lot of money, but but I think it's kind of fruitless to say, well, the Republican, the world is different, the society is different, the issues are different, and the parties are very different, even though they keep the same names, I guess. Okay, let's see about, after having such success in defeating the Klan, how could Reconstruction fall so soon after that? Yeah, that's a big question about the 1870s. As I said in my lecture, Grant did crush the Klan in 1871 into 72, sending troops, sending marshals, having trials. Many leading Klansmen fled the country, going to Canada, and the peace and quiet reigned for a while. But the problem was that even as that's going on, support for Reconstruction is diminishing in the North. I spoke about this last week. The liberal Republicans, or maybe it's this week, actually, now that I think about it. So maybe it's coming up right now in week 8. So the changes going on in the North are undermining support for Reconstruction. Changes in the Republican Party, economic change, which is leading to fairly vigorous economic conflict between capital and labor. And then the economic depression, which begins in 1873, kind of really directs attention away from Reconstruction. It also leads to, in 1874, Democrats, for the first time since the war, gaining control of the House of Representatives, which means Congress is not going to do anything more on Reconstruction. And the sense that support in the North is waning for Reconstruction and for enforcing the equal rights of the former slaves, the sense that that's happening, it catalyzes another wave of violence in the South. 1874, 75, 76, Alabama, 1874, Mississippi, 1875, South Carolina, Louisiana, 1876. These are states with pretty strong black majorities, and you're not going to win there just by normal voting, and they have to use violence to try to intimidate people and keep them from voting and disrupt the Republican Party. And that's what happens. And at that point, the Northern Republican Party has pretty much abandoned the idea of federal intervention to stop violence in the South. So it is, it is difficult to explain. I agree that how, after one very successful intervention in the South by President Grant, violence a few years later again comes and is then much more successful in these deep, deep South states. I think it's because of changes in the North and the waning support for Reconstruction in the North that reverberates into Washington and makes it impossible for the federal government to intervene again. Okay. Do you have a short list of bad federal policies and bad U.S. Supreme Court rulings that undid some of what Reconstruction tried to do? Yeah, I wrote an article a couple of years ago in the Columbia Law Review. I'm not a law professor. I know a few. I sometimes lecture at law schools, but I'm not a law professor. My article is about how the Supreme Court has continuously, starting in the 1870s, and even up to today in some ways, misunderstood the Reconstruction era, misinterpreted the major amendments of that period, the 14th and 15th Amendments. We just saw an example of that a couple of years ago when they invalidated the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which the Voting Rights Act is passed under the 15th Amendment, a Reconstruction amendment. And the second clause of that says Congress has the power to enforce the right to vote for black people. That's not the exact language, obviously, but Congress has the power to enforce it. That's pretty clear. Well, Supreme Court, no, Congress shouldn't really be doing this. Congress should not be trying to get these states to let everyone vote. Misinterpretation of the 15th Amendment completely. But I traced out, so you can start with Slaughterhouse. I mean, I don't want to go through every single case here. I will actually, in the final week, talk about this. So wait another week, and I do talk about some of the famous cases. Slaughterhouse, Cruikshank, Plessy v. Ferguson, Williams v. Mississippi. Little by little, it didn't all happen in 1 year or one time. Little by little, the Supreme Court whittles away at the interpretation of the 14th, 15th Amendments and the enforcement of rights under those amendments, and allows, it's the acquiescence of the court, allows basically a new form of white supremacy to be instigated in the South in flagrant violation of what the 14th and 15th Amendments were trying to do, but the Supreme Court allows it to happen. And even long later on, when they begin to reverse themselves, the 1940s, 1950s, and then of course the Warren Court of the 50s and 60s, they never really repudiate many of those bad decisions. They're still good law. They're still part of the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, and I think that has deleterious effects on our jurisprudence even today. The worst federal policy, if you want to ask about bad federal policy, was a negative, just withdrawing from enforcing the law. I mean, it's just something as simple as that, enforcing the law. That's what the government is supposed to do. Laws were passed, amendments were passed, giving people basic rights, and then those rights start getting taken away and the government stands aside and does nothing. So that's bad policy, to put it, to say the least. Okay, let's see who's next here. Other than Abraham Lincoln, who is the person you find most interesting from the Civil War Reconstruction period? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm very interested in Thaddeus Stevens. I wrote an article about him once. I'm a member of the Thaddeus Stevens Society, which is based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, his hometown. Stevens was the great radical Republican, and Stevens, before the war, during the war, after the war, was a principled, vigorous really important advocate of the rights of African Americans. When, well before the war, 1837, Stevens was a delegate to the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention. And at that convention, they took the right to vote away from the free black population of Pennsylvania, which included a pretty significant, well-educated, propertied, free black population in Philadelphia. They were certainly as qualified to vote as most white people were, but nonetheless, the right to vote was taken away from blacks in Pennsylvania. Stevens walked out of the convention. He refused to sign the Constitution because he said, I'm not signing a document that is so inegalitarian. Now, there was no conceivable political benefit to Thaddeus Stevens in 1837 for standing up for the rights of African Americans, but he did it. And then later on, of course, in the 1850s, he's a radical Republican to urging that, that the Republican Party stand firm in opposing the westward expansion of slavery. And then during the Civil War, he was advocating early on for emancipation, black troops. Now, of course, in Reconstruction, he's associated with the idea of land distribution. 40 acres and a mule. Stevens wants the government to confiscate the land of the former owners, and distribute some of it to the former slaves and sell some of it and get northern whites to come down and do all sorts of things with it. But in a certain sense, his main aim is to destroy the planter class. You take away their land, they've lost their slaves, but they still have their land. You take away their land, they're finished, and then you can have a different political system in the South. Whether one thinks that's a good idea or not, it wasn't a total panacea. But so Stevens is an interesting guy to me. He's the far edge. He's the radical edge of the radical era of Civil War and Reconstruction. But on the other hand, I'm also very interested in just anonymous people or very little known people. These former slaves who are now trying to take part in government in the South. You know, one of the books I wrote was called Freedom's Lawmakers, which is it's a directory, a biographical directory of something like 1,500 African-American men who held some public office in Reconstruction. Some of them well-known, so, senators, members of Congress. Most of them are just anonymous, low-level, justice of the peace, sheriff, school board official, member of the legislature, whatever we could find out. A lot of them, there's very, very little information. But I wanted to put them on the map of history. Get their names out there, their pictures, if one could find them, whatever information one can find. And it's certainly not complete, because it's still information that is lying around to be dug up. But I find very interesting in this period just the effort of ordinary people to try to make this a better country. And so that the famous people like Lincoln, very anonymous people whose names have been lost to history almost, is also fascinating what they were doing. Okay. 40 acres and a mule. We're often asked about that. Can you go into more detail about the term 40 acres and a mule and its significance to the Reconstruction era? I think I answered this question in a Google Hangout in the second course on the Civil War, but that's all right. 40 acres and a mule, I think the concept, the term originates with General Sherman's Field Order number 15 in January 1865, when he had taken Savannah after the march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah, and he met with a group of black ministers in Savannah, and they talked about freedom and slavery. And one of the things he said to them was, well, what would be the best way for you to live as free people? And they said, well, give us land. We can take care of ourselves. Give us land. We'll support our families. We won't be dependent on white people anymore. And the next day or two, Sherman issued this order dividing up a whole big area of land along the coast and inland from South Carolina and Georgia, saying, okay, this land now is going to be divided up into 40-acre plots, and black families can settle on it. And they can have some mules too, he said. A lot of mules working in the army, a lot of them are broken down. Take the mule, get them back to health, you can have them. And a lot of black families were settled on what they call Sherman land, 40 acres and a mule. But then, of course, Andrew Johnson comes in and he returns all that land to the original owners during the course of 1865. Now, more generally, 40 acres and a mule is a term that reverberates all around Reconstruction. It symbolizes, it's a way of expressing the African-American desire for land, that they want economic resources as well as civil rights, political rights. They felt that what Lincoln in his second inaugural called 250 years of unrequited labor. They had 250 years of stolen labor had gave them justification for getting land now as a kind of compensation for all the work they had done, and to give them this independence, which was necessary for freedom. Well, of course, it didn't happen. A few blacks got land, but most didn't. Government did not distribute land, and most of them had no choice, therefore, but to go to work for white employers of one kind or another. So it's a very important part of the debate over Reconstruction, this concept of land distribution and trying to, excuse me, trying to combine some effort at economic equality with the civil and political equality, which was put into the laws in Reconstruction. Okay. I recently had the pleasure of reading your New York Times op-ed, Why Reconstruction Matters. Thank you. Can you go into more detail regarding your statement that the supposed horrors of Reconstruction were evoked as far away as South Africa and Australia? Interesting question. You know, in an op-ed of 1,500 words, you have to be very economical in what you can and don't say. And so I didn't have the, the space to elaborate on that. But I'm basing that largely on a book that was published a few years ago by a couple of Australian scholars called Drawing the Global Color Line. Hunt was one, and I can't remember the name of the other. But anyway, Drawing the Global Color Line. And what they showed was that this is around 1900, that period, after the end of Reconstruction, that there was a kind of community of interest among self-proclaimed countries representing white civilization. The United States was one of them, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Within a 10 or 15-year period, all of those places adopt policies which have a kind of kinship: segregation in the US, apartheid in South Africa, Chinese exclusion in Canada and the US, and what they called the White Australia policy, just banning non-white immigration and voting and all this. And what they show is that in the debates in these legislatures, people frequently referred to Reconstruction. They did so via a book called The American Commonwealth, written by a British writer, James Bryce, who came to the US in the 1880s and wrote a lot about American government, the American Commonwealth he wrote. And he talked about the modes of government in the US, and also he thought things were fairly corrupt over here. And but anyway, he described the whole governmental system. But one of the things he said was that Reconstruction was a total disaster. It was corruption, it was misgovernment. And why? Why? Because black people had been given the right to vote. The failure of Reconstruction, said Bryce, shows that non-white people cannot participate in government. And that was then put forward in South Africa, Australia. Look, we have Aboriginal people here, we have black Africans, but you cannot allow them to take part in political life. Look what happened in Reconstruction. They tried that in the US. It was a total disaster. So that's what I'm talking about telegraphically in that article, that this international debate or discussion about creating white supremacist regimes all around the world, and how the alleged failure of Reconstruction is invoked to justify that, among other reasons. Okay. Did pacifism as a belief rise in popularity during Reconstruction? Pacifism, I don't really know about that. There was certainly a lot of violence, and maybe people thought that was not a good idea, but pacifism was not a major political category in the 19th century. There were peace societies. The abolitionists were pacifists up to the Civil War. Then they decided they weren't. They believed in moral suasion. But I don't think pacifism, I suppose you could argue that the devastating results of the Civil War and the tremendous loss of life may have persuaded some people that pacifism was a good idea. But I do not remember seeing a lot of evidence of organized pacifist activity in the aftermath of the Civil War. No. All right. What is this? What is your take on recent events like that? Yesterday, I wasn't aware of this, in the Texas House of Representatives Committee on Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, replacing Confederate Heroes Day with Civil War Remembrance Day. They did that in Texas. Interesting. I guess there are probably, this is a tourism committee, according to the title, right? And they want to attract tourists. And there are probably many people in the United States who do not feel comfortable commemorating Confederate heroes. And I'm not just talking about African Americans or Hispanics or many Northerners. I do not want to denigrate the ancestors of people in Texas, but, causing a war in order to defend the institution of slavery may not be the best way to be considered a hero. So I guess it's an attempt to be more neutral. Instead of Confederate heroes, Civil War Remembrance Day. Both sides, people who sympathize with the South, with the North, can say, okay, Civil War Remembrance. Now, remember, Texas, there's always a debate about whether Texas is a southern state or a western state, and it's both, I guess. It was part of the Confederacy. It did have slavery, but its culture is a little bit different than, let's say, the deep, deep South. So it's not my job to tell Texas how they should remember their history. If they want to change the name, that's fine with me. We don't have a Confederate Heroes Day here in New York, so that issue does not arise. All right, let's see what's next. Were there any geographical areas within the former Confederacy where the former slaves achieved greater political, economic, and social equality? Interesting. Well, yeah, of course, things varied in the ex-Confederacy in the South. In no place did Reconstruction, survive all that long. But certainly, one of the things I'm going to emphasize in the final session, the final week, is that the transition from the end of Reconstruction to a new system, which we call Jim Crow as a kind of shorthand of segregation, disenfranchisement, and many, many other forms of inequality. It happens in different ways in different places. In Virginia, for example, blacks got actually a lot of land. A lot of blacks got little pieces of land in Virginia eventually. The agricultural situation was very, very different there than in the Deep South. And there were little enclaves of, black communities that were set up. There was one in Mississippi by Benjamin Montgomery, one of the leading slave overseer almost under Joseph Davis and Jefferson Davis on their plantations in Davis Bend, which, before the Civil War and after the war, Montgomery and his family do very well at Davis Bend. And then later, when Davis Bend goes back to the Davis family, they go in another place in Mississippi and form their own black community. I can't quite remember the name of that town. But there are these black towns created in some parts of the South, which actually afford people a little more autonomy. But the basic fact is that by 1900, the region as a whole, and in each of these states, you have this system set in place of segregation, disenfranchisement, deep economic inequality, devastation of black education, which doesn't leave a lot of room for maneuver among black people, unfortunately. Okay, let's see. By the way, I saw somebody posted a note that floated by on the screen that Marilyn Lake and somebody Reynolds, not Hunt, I got that wrong. Lake and Reynolds were the two authors of Drawing the Global Color Line. So in the interest of accuracy, thank you for pointing that out. In your updated book, thank you. Yes, I did in January or December publish my old books on Reconstruction with new introductions, trying to talk about what's happened in the scholarship lately. In your book, you mentioned you discovered correspondence of the Reconstruction governors in the South Carolina archives in 1978. Are these documents now online? Do you think there remain other primary sources which will show? Well, all right, that's a good question. I talked about the governor's papers. The governor's papers. These are the letters received by the governor. And by the way, they have that in every state. But in South Carolina, they have more. They keep, I don't know, they just keep everything down there, which is great for historians. And there were like 121 boxes of these governor's papers, just letters to the governors from everybody. I mean, former slaves, former owners, Klansmen, religious people, you name it, about what's going on. A lot of it was, I need a job, governor, or my hog ran away and trampled on someone else's, crops. I don't know. But a lot of it was very moving, actually, discussions of what's going on in Reconstruction, what people's aspirations are, what their fears are. I don't think those documents are online. I have not looked at the South Carolina State Archives website. You can certainly do that. It's just called the South Carolina Archives. I doubt if they've digitalized. Maybe they have. It's not impossible. And every state has that. When I was doing my research, I used the governor's papers of North Carolina, of Mississippi, of Alabama. And there are plenty. In other words, as Abraham Lincoln said, not everything is online. People, my students sometimes think every single thing is online. No, it isn't. There's a lot of stuff that is still there, just in manuscript form or in other form, books, newspapers, which has not been digitalized. And so you do have to go to the libraries and the archives to do research. I was very fortunate that this was long before digitalization existed, or there was no line to be on in 1978. So I did it the old-fashioned way, going through 121 boxes of stuff. But they were so courteous, so helpful. Wilma Waits, the archivist, I still remember, it's a long time ago, so very helpful to a Yankee coming down doing research, that I think very, very fondly of my time in Columbia, South Carolina, doing that kind of research. Okay. You have said several times, yes, I repeat myself, that history gets rewritten in each generation, and you've given several examples in historiography. What do you think will be the next rewrite of Civil War history? Interesting. Well, it's sort of going on right now. The latest trend, so to speak, in the writing of American history in general is what they call internationalizing it, trying to put American history more into a global or international context or framework. For example, a former student of mine, Sven Beckert, has just won the Bancroft Prize, which will be given out at a nice dinner here at Columbia next week, for his book, The Empire of Cotton, which is a global history of cotton. The US and the South and the Civil War play an important part in it, but so do many other places. And it shows you how cotton was such a key commodity in capitalistic development in the 19th century. And it ranges to Egypt and India and other places. So America's history is in there, and the Civil War is in there, but it's in this broad context. And there are many, and I think Don Doyle just published a book a couple of months ago about a sort of international history of the Civil War, about the impact of the American Civil War in other countries, politically, economically, intellectually. So it seems now, and even Reconstruction, there is now more work being done comparing the end of slavery in the US with what happened after slavery in other places. Peter Colchin, very fine scholar at Delaware, is finishing a book, I believe, comparing the aftermath of slavery in the US with the aftermath of serfdom in Russia, because as you know, the serfs were emancipated during the American Civil War, actually, 1861. Now, serfdom and slavery is not the same thing. It's a very different history, but there are still points of comparison. So I think that's one tendency. Maybe that's just a function of the globalized world we live in. A globalized world needs a globalized history. It's not going to replace all other history, but it is an interesting trend. What will happen after that, I don't know, because as I've also repeated many times, the present gives us our questions. So what will people be interested in or debating, or what will be roiling our society in 2030? I don't know. But whatever it is will reverberate back on how we think about earlier periods in American history, including the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okie doke. Why does PBS Pinchback succeed in becoming the first black governor in Louisiana? Well, first of all, he was only governor for a week, so let's not get too excited. But he was the only black person who held the office of governor at all during Reconstruction. That's because the previous governor was impeached and removed from office right when his term was ending. And Pinchback was the lieutenant governor, and so really for a week, he held the office until the governor who had been elected then took office. Pinchback was a, what is the word we should use? A politician, an operator. He was definitely out for one thing, Pinchback. He was a very ambitious guy, and he seized the opportunity when it came along, and he was an early Politico in the Republican Party, and he got himself nominated for lieutenant governor. And Pinchback, I've said many times in this course, there was corruption in Reconstruction. The old view that it was totally corrupt is not true, but there was certainly corruption, just as there was in the rest of the country, the Grant administration, the Tweed ring. Pinchback made a killing while he was in office. He left office a lot richer than he went in, and it wasn't because of his salary, I'll tell you that. But nonetheless, as lieutenant governor, he became governor just briefly when the predecessor was removed from office. Okay. Can you speak more to the role blackface minstrelsy played before and during Reconstruction on the violence aimed at African Americans? I don't know that there's a direct connection between blackface minstrelsy and violence. Minstrelsy was a very, very popular form of entertainment in the 19th century and into the 20th century. It's astonishing. If you look at Hollywood movies of the 1930s, even into the early 40s, you will see blackface minstrel routines in musicals, which to our eye today are utterly offensive, but they're in there. Go look at Meet Me in St. Louis with Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney. There's a blackface minstrel number in there. It's unbelievable. But in the 19th century, I guess you could say, well, it certainly was a way of propagating and spreading very stereotypical portraits of black people. They were either ridiculous, like, free blacks who got all dressed up and try to act as if they were civilized, but of course we know they weren't, or stupid, like plantation hands who didn't know which way was up, or, different tropes, different characters, or none of them to be admired, except there is a literature on this, of course, and the historians all debate each other, of course. There are those who say actually some blackface minstrelsy is white people with blackface, but some of them actually admired black dance and theatricality and tried to model their own dance routines on real, actual black dancers, some of whom were, tremendously talented. So there was an element of imitation as well as ridicule. But whether it had anything to do with violence, I don't think there's a direct connection, no. All right. The role that maroon communities may or may not have played in the Civil War and Reconstruction. That is an interesting question, and there are people working on that now. And the answer is still not quite clear. Maroon communities are these communities of escaped slaves. Many escaped slaves came to the North in Canada. Some escaped slaves found refuge in the swampy, like the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia, or some of the really backwoods, piney woods areas, very inaccessible. And they set up little communities out there, which managed to survive up through the Everglades of Florida. And apparently they did have a presence in the Civil War. I was reading somewhere someone talking about a few white soldiers who escaped from Andersonville prison, Union soldiers. Andersonville, the notorious prison in Georgia where many, many people died. But a few people managed to escape and were helped by Maroons, but they somehow managed to find themselves in these areas where there was Maroons who would help them get back to Union lines or something like that. In the Reconstruction era, I didn't really see a lot of evidence of this because I think once slavery's over, there is no need to be a Maroon community. You don't have to hide out anymore. You're not afraid of being recaptured and become a slave. So I think Maroon communities probably dissipated in Reconstruction as people just joined up with the now large free communities which were out there. Abolitionism had a significant impact on the Republican Party before and during the war. What happened to the former abolitionists after the 15th Amendment? Very good question. There never were all that many abolitionists, I must emphasize. They were a small group, very vocal and important in some ways, but not a giant operation. But nonetheless, I think after the 15th Amendment, really, you might almost say marked the end of the abolitionist movement. You know, in 1865, when William Lloyd Garrison said the American Anti-Slavery Society should dissolve. We have accomplished our goal. Slavery is dead. My vocation as an abolitionist is ended, said Garrison. But Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, and others said, no, we are not ended. Douglass said, the black man is still unfree if he does not have the right to vote. And so the abolitionist movement voted Garrison down. I mean, they said, no, we're not dissolving. And Wendell Phillips became the head of the organization. But then 5 years later, in 1870, they did dissolve. When the 15th Amendment is adopted and states are prohibited from discriminating and voting on the basis of race, then the abolitionist movement dissolves as a organized, entity. But of course, individuals don't dissolve; they go down different paths. Phillips went into the labor movement in Massachusetts. Others, James Miller McKim, helped set up relief organizations for African Americans. In other words, the abolitionist movement, maybe the way to think of it is this: it was a big stream, like a river, and eventually it kind of goes off into different tributaries. Some of them go into various prison reform, other reform. People don't just go away. They go down, they find other things. Some of them continue to fight for the rights of the former slaves after 1870, but there no longer was an abolitionist movement as an organized entity after 1870. Okay. Taking History of American Capitalism. That's the MOOC by Baptist and Hyman. Is that the one you're talking about up coming out of Cornell? Hyman, another former student of ours here, fine fellow. They consider the southern states as capitalists, as slaves were valuable property. Yes, they do. This is a debate that's been going on for a long time among historians. Eric Williams, great scholar, long ago, wrote a book called Capitalism and Slavery. Karl Marx talked about whether slavery was capitalist. He said, yeah, of course it's capitalist. It's not the debate. It's a form of capitalism. But there were others that said, no, it's not really capitalist. Unfree labor is not capitalist. Capitalism needs a labor market. It needs a free labor market. It needs the ability to mobilize labor and move it and get rid of if you don't want it. It's profit. This Old South is profit oriented, but so are cavemen. The first caveman who got 2 rocks for one, he wasn't a capitalist. Capitalism is a social system. Now, is the Old South capitalist today? More historians argue, yes, it was. It was fundamentally producing a key commodity for the world market. Southern planters were pioneers in modern accounting methods and other things like that. They were not just backward-looking and uneconomical. Slaves were valuable property, as this question suggests, absolutely. They were the most valuable property in the country. The slaves as property were worth more than all the banks and factories and railroads put together. But I think one must remember there are varieties of capitalism. Industrial capitalism is developing in the North in this period. The South had serious obstacles to developing industrial capitalism. So it was a form of capitalism, but much more commercial and agricultural. And therefore, probably eventually it would have fallen further and further behind the North, even if slavery had continued, just because it didn't have the resources for industrial development. But that, it's a complicated question, but I'm not going to contradict what those two fellows are saying in their course. If you were writing the history of Reconstruction in X number of artifacts, documents, similar to Harold Holzer's The Civil War in 50 Objects, what would they be? 50, 20, I don't know. What would the Emancipation Proclamation be number 1? Well, my book on Reconstruction, published a long time ago, begins with the Emancipation Proclamation. This is not because the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery on the day it was issued, but because that's when I think the problem of Reconstruction begins. In other words, the proclamation says if the North wins the war, slavery is going to be abolished. If the South wins, nothing we can do about that. If you commit the Union to abolishing slavery, you are committed to a reconstruction, some kind of reconstruction. It means you cannot go back to the pre-war Union. There is going to be a social transformation in the South. What that will be is certainly up for grabs, and nobody knew in 1863. But so, yeah, I would start with the Emancipation Proclamation. I would have things about Reconstruction during the Civil War. Maybe I couldn't fit it in 50 objects, although Harold fitted his 50 objects in there from the New York Historical Society. One of the problems is it's hard to find artifacts of Reconstruction. You have letters, speeches, petitions, things like that. You don't have weaponry. Well, I guess you could have Klan weaponry and Klan robes. That would be kind of good. But it's hard to think of the three-dimensional artifacts you would have along with the, written documents of one kind or another. But yeah, maybe we'll try to do that sometime. I'll call up Harold, see what he wants. Do local histories and monuments in the South overlook the history of Southerners who fought for the Union or supported African Americans in Reconstruction? Yeah, they sure do. You find me a few of those, not very many. There aren't a heck of a lot of monuments to Black leaders of Reconstruction, I'll tell you that. There aren't a lot of monuments to so-called scalawags, that is, Southern white people who cooperated with these African Americans in Reconstruction. No, I think the public history, the visible public history in the South is very one-dimensional when it comes to the Civil War. My position on this, I know some people say, hey, take them down. No, my position is not take down the statue of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was an important leader of the South. He deserves a statue. But so does Robert Smalls, the congressman, the Black congressman from the Sea Islands in South Carolina. And so does Hiram Revels, the first Black member of the Senate. And so does Thaddeus Stevens or others. Maybe there is one of Thaddeus Stevens in Lancaster, not in the South, I'm sure of that. So does James Longstreet, a definite red-blooded Southerner, Lee's right-hand man at Gettysburg. Told Lee, hey, this picket charge is a bad idea, man. You're going to get slaughtered. Lee did it anyway. There's no monument to him. Why? Because he supported Black rights in Reconstruction. That eliminated him. So, yeah, the public monuments and things have to be diversified enormously in the South to give a full picture of the history of that region. That's all. Let's see what we have here. Do you have a point of view on the historian as activist? Do you see historians such as W.B. Du Bois, E.P. Thompson, Howard Zinn, Peniel Joseph in a different light than other historians? That's an interesting question. Historians are citizens, right? We have a right and duty as citizens in a democracy to express our views, to try to affect public policy if we want to. Now, of course, the people you mentioned are, as you said, they define themselves as activist historians. Du Bois, Peniel, maybe not quite as much as Zinn or Thompson, but still, yes, they all want their history to help influence social change. They think they're writing histories which will illuminate how social change happened in the past and how it might happen in the present. They're intervening, their histories intervene in public debates directly, not indirectly as others do. But I don't think, it's an interesting question. Do I see them in a different light? I admire Du Bois, Thompson, Zinn enormously. Joseph is a very, very good historian. But I admire a lot of historians who aren't doing this. I don't necessarily see them in a different light. I may see them in a different light as citizens. They're more activist as citizens, but their history has to stand or fall on its scholarly merit on the same grounds that any other history, its use of sources, the strength of the argument, et cetera, et cetera. And, those books that you mentioned are very, very good books, but they're scholarly books. They're not just activism thrown out, for a particular purpose. I mean, I'm not as activist as Howard Zinn or W.B. Du Bois, but I try to make my opinions known. I write for The Nation magazine. I write, as someone said, op-ed piece for the New York Times. I try to take part as a citizen in public events. Everybody ought to do that. I don't think there's any contradiction between being a historian and being someone who is committed to social change, but your history is judged as history, not as a vehicle for, political action. So you have to make sure your history is good history, no matter what your motivation is. Why should there be a monument or memorial to Reconstruction? Why should it be memorialized like soldiers, battles, former slaves? Well, when I say a monument to Reconstruction, I'm talking more about historical sites, museums, things like that. Yeah, there's a difference between a statue of Stonewall Jackson and a monument to Reconstruction. But there are monuments to abstractions. There were these statues put up in the South of the Mammy, the faithful slave. That's not an individual. That's a kind of a concept. But there were statues like that in the South. More interesting, I think, is the fact that, as we have said before, there are no museums really devoted to slavery. One just is opening in Louisiana, I gather. I haven't seen it. There's very little presence of Reconstruction in public history museums. There should be monuments of individuals connected to Reconstruction, as I was saying a minute ago. Black leaders, white leaders, people who fought the fight of Reconstruction, a part of that history. They should be recognized in public history also. And in our museums in Washington and other places, the Reconstruction period ought to be portrayed as an important part of the history of this country. Now, we have only 4 minutes, I see, so I'm going to scoot along and maybe take a couple more questions. You've spoken about the Dunning School that was developed by Dunning here at Columbia, how influential he was. Do you see your work at Columbia as a kind of antidote, pardon me, as an antidote? I have no personal animus against Dunning because he was at Columbia. I do think there is a certain irony here, and I say that in my book. Dunning and Burgess and their students at Columbia created what we call the traditional view of Reconstruction, which lasted for a long, long time. Yes, we at Columbia are aware that Dunning was here. By the way, when I was offered a job at Columbia a long, long time ago, one of the incentives, or not incentive, one of the things I was told was really good about Columbia was that because we had Dunning and Burgess and then people following them, our library, Butler Library, has a fantastic collection of works on the Civil War era. That we have any book you want, we've got it. And that's because Dunning was here and then successors of his. So, yeah, but it's not Columbia University is not responsible for Dunning or Burgess, and they're not responsible for me either. I do enjoy the irony a little bit that the anti-Dunning view comes out of the place that Dunning was at, and also that in the history department, we have a little fund where I'm not kidding, $250 a year. Every professor gets $250. It's not indexed for inflation either. And it's called the Dunning Fund. You can use it like to pay for Xeroxes or something, or I don't know, whatever research course up to $250 you have. So we have the Dunning Fund. So I said in my book, in the preface, it's ironic that some of the research for this book was funded by the Dunning Fund at Columbia. But I don't, we're not talking about an individual or a place. We're talking about a general point of view, which certainly spread way beyond Dunning. All right, we have time for maybe one more question. Where are we? My team here is choosing the questions as they come up. If a student wanted to use this topic for a master's degree, where do you suggest he or she begins? Selecting objects, documents, or listing the important topics that should be included, then try? That is an interesting question. How do you go about doing historical research? I wish I had more than a minute. Usually, you choose a question. It's not even a topic. It's a topic and a question. I'm interested in reading. Well, what do I want to find out? What am I really trying to figure out about this subject? It could be a small issue. It could be a big issue. Then you say, okay, to answer that question, what kind of sources do I need? I need the letters of politicians, or maybe if it's about land, I need agricultural information or census reports on land ownership or whatever it was, Constitution. what do I need to answer the question I'm interested in? So you start with a question. Now that's how I usually work. But in my most recent book about the Underground Railroad in New York, etc., I actually started with a document. I wrote about this in the book that a student pointed out to me that was here in our Columbia Library, but almost never used by historians, which is about fugitive slaves passing through New York City in 1855 and 56. I started with this remarkable document giving the voice of these fugitives and then try to figure out what to do with it. And it took me a long time to kind of work pathways out of it. So if you find a new, amazing, remarkable document, yeah, go with it. But otherwise, start with a question, start with an issue, and then try to say, okay, what do I need to know to answer this question? And where do I find that information? That's how you do your research. It is 8 o'clock Eastern Time, and I want to thank you all for taking part in this discussion, this Google Hangout, and I look forward to your participation in the last 2 weeks of this online course.